The Supreme Court chamber carried an atmosphere of heightened attention as oral arguments proceeded on a landmark case involving reproductive rights and the scope of federal authority to regulate medical practice. Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat on the bench with an expression that observers would later describe as combining skepticism with barely concealed amusement, as he listened to Jasmine Crockett present arguments defending federal legislation protecting access to reproductive health care across state lines. The Texas Congresswoman stood at the council's lectern in her capacity, representing congressional leadership that had enacted the challenge statute following the overturning of constitutional abortion protections. Kavanaugh had been formulating a line of questioning designed to expose what he perceived as fundamental weaknesses in the constitutional foundations for federal reproductive health care legislation. His demeanor suggested confidence that his questions would demonstrate the legislation's incompatibility with constitutional principles of federalism and limited enumerated powers. What transpired over the following 20 minutes would become one of the most discussed moments in recent Supreme Court history, transforming what appeared to be a routine exchange into a defining confrontation about judicial temperament, constitutional interpretation, and the treatment of women advocates before the nation's highest court. Before examining this extraordinary moment that forced national conversation about respect, expertise, and gender dynamics in constitutional litigation, please comment with your location and subscribe to ensure comprehensive coverage of these developments affecting fundamental rights and the culture of our highest judicial institution. Justice Brett Kavanaugh had joined the Supreme Court in 2018 following a contentious confirmation process that had exposed deep partisan divisions and raised questions about judicial temperament and respect for women that would continue shadowing his tenure on the bench. His jurisprudence reflected conservative constitutional interpretation, emphasizing originalist methodology, skepticism toward expansive federal regulatory authority, and commitment to protecting religious liberty and traditional values. On reproductive rights specifically, Kavanaugh had joined the majority opinion overturning constitutional abortion protections, writing separately to emphasize his view that the Constitution remained neutral on abortion policy and left such decisions to democratic processes at the state level. His judicial philosophy held that federal courts should not recognize unenumerated rights unsupported by constitutional text and historical tradition, a methodology that led to narrow readings of constitutional protections for personal autonomy and bodily integrity. The legislation under challenge represented Congress's response to the post-Roe landscape in which multiple states had enacted severe restrictions or complete bans on reproductive health care services. The federal statute sought to protect access to reproductive health care through multiple mechanisms, including prohibiting state interference with interstate travel for medical services, preventing states from imposing criminal or civil liability on healthcare providers for services lawfully provided in their jurisdictions, and establishing federal protections for medication abortion access through telemedicine and mail delivery. Congressional supporters argued that the legislation was authorized by the Commerce Clause, given the interstate nature of reproductive health care services, and by the 14th Amendment's protections for liberty and equal protection. They compiled extensive factual records documenting how reproductive health care restrictions affected interstate commerce, imposed severe burdens on women's health and economic participation, and created discriminatory impacts on low-income women and women of color who lacked resources to navigate patchwork state regulations. Challenging states argued that the legislation exceeded congressional authority by commandeering state regulatory functions, by intruding on core state police powers over medical practice, and by effectively imposing a national abortion policy, despite the Supreme Court's determination that such matters belong to democratic processes rather than constitutional mandate. The litigation presented fundamental questions about the scope of congressional authority in the post-Roe constitutional environment and about whether federal protections for reproductive health care could survive judicial review. Before a conservative Supreme Court skeptical of both abortion rights and expansive federal power, Jasmine Crockett had been selected to defend the legislation through a combination of her legal expertise, her congressional involvement in crafting the statute, and her unique perspective as a woman who understood firsthand the stakes involved in reproductive health care access. Her preparation for oral argument had been intensive, recognizing that prevailing before hostile justices would require demonstrating unassailable constitutional foundations while anticipating and neutralizing arguments designed to portray the legislation as federal overreach. She understood that some justices would approach the case with predetermined views about abortion policy and federal power, making her task not simply presenting legal arguments, but rather exposing inconsistencies and demanding intellectual honesty from justices whose jurisprudence often reflected selective application of principles depending on preferred outcomes. The oral argument had proceeded for approximately 30 minutes, with various justices posing predictable questions about Commerce Clause authority and state sovereignty, when Justice Kavanaugh began a line of questioning that would lead to the confrontation. He asked whether Congress truly believed it could rely on the Commerce Clause to regulate what was essentially medical practice traditionally governed by state law, his tone carrying suggestion that the constitutional theory underlying the legislation was transparently pretextual. Crockett responded by explaining that the legislation regulated interstate aspects of reproductive health care, including travel across state lines, provision of services to out-of-state patients, and distribution of medication through interstate commerce channels. She noted that the Commerce Clause had consistently been understood to authorize federal regulation of interstate activity, even when that activity related to subjects that states also regulated. Kavanaugh followed with a question suggesting that accepting congressional authority in this domain would essentially eliminate any meaningful limits on federal power, allowing Congress to regulate virtually any human activity by characterizing it as affecting interstate commerce. His question reflected familiar conservative concerns about maintaining constitutional boundaries on federal authority through judicially enforced limits on the Commerce Clause. Crockett responded that the legislation was carefully tailored to address genuinely interstate dimensions of reproductive health care, and that constitutional limits on federal power remained meaningful in domains lacking such interstate connections. She explained that the Supreme Court's own precedents established workable distinctions between economic activity substantially affecting interstate commerce and purely local activity beyond congressional reach. The justice posed a third question, asking whether the legislation's prohibition on state interference with interstate travel might conflict with legitimate state interests in enforcing their laws within their territories. This question suggested concern that federal protections for traveling to obtain reproductive health care could undermine state sovereignty by preventing states from imposing consequences for conduct they had determined to prohibit. Crockett responded that the constitutional right to interstate travel had long been recognized as fundamental, and that states could not impose burdens on that right simply because residents exercised it to access services legal in other jurisdictions. She noted that allowing states to penalize interstate travel for abortion services would create exactly the sort of barriers to interstate movement that constitutional travel protections were designed to prevent. Justice Kavanaugh then asked whether the Congresswoman was essentially arguing that states had no legitimate interest in protecting what many citizens viewed as prenatal life, his question framing state abortion restrictions as reflecting valid moral concerns rather than efforts to control women's bodies and life choices. Crockett responded that the legislation did not dispute that states could express views about prenatal life, but rather established that such views could not justify imposing criminal penalties on women who traveled to other states or on providers who offered services legal in their own jurisdictions. She explained that the federal system contemplated that states would have different policies on controversial moral questions, and that the solution was allowing individuals to access services in states whose policies aligned with their needs rather than permitting restrictive states to impose their policies extraterritorially. The fifth question from Justice Kavanaugh suggested that the medication abortion provisions of the legislation might exceed congressional authority by preventing states from regulating medical practice within their borders. He asked whether federal preemption of state pharmacy and medical regulations related to abortion medication represented appropriate exercise of congressional power or impermissible intrusion on core state functions. Crockett responded by distinguishing between federal regulation of interstate distribution of medication through channels of commerce and state regulation of medical practice more broadly. She explained that the legislation addressed distribution of federally approved medications through interstate commerce without preventing states from regulating medical practice in ways that did not discriminate against reproductive taper, health care, or burden access to services lawful under federal protections. Justice Kavanaugh posed a sixth question that began revealing the condescension that would ultimately provoke Crockett's devastating response. He asked, with evident skepticism, whether the Congresswoman really expected the court to believe that the legislation was a good faith exercise of congressional authority rather than an attempt to circumvent the court's decision, eliminating constitutional abortion protections. His tone carried implication that the constitutional arguments she was presenting were merely pretexts for achieving policy outcomes through federal legislation after losing constitutional protection through judicial decision. The question reflected an attitude treating reproductive rights advocates as necessarily disingenuous, rather than as presenting legitimate constitutional arguments deserving serious engagement. Crockett maintained composure while responding that Congress had acted based on extensive factual findings about interstate aspects of reproductive health care and had carefully structured the legislation to fall within established constitutional authority. She noted that suggesting congressional civil rights protections were pretextual simply because they addressed subjects the court had declined to protect, constitutionally reflected the same skepticism of legislative authority that had been used historically to undermine federal civil rights enforcement. Her response identified the parallel between current questioning of reproductive health care legislation and historical resistance to civil rights laws, making explicit that dismissing congressional authority as pretextual represented a familiar strategy for limiting federal protection of fundamental rights. The seventh question from Justice Kavanaugh revealed even more clearly the attitude that was building toward confrontation. He asked with a slight smile whether Ms. Crockett was comparing abortion legislation to the Civil Rights Act, his tone suggesting that such comparison was absurd and revealed confused thinking about constitutional categories. The smile and tone conveyed that he found her argument not simply unpersuasive, but rather laughably misguided, treating her constitutional reasoning as unworthy of serious consideration. Several observers in the courtroom would later report hearing what sounded like a suppressed chuckle from the justice as he posed this question, a breach of decorum that reflected contempt rather than judicial neutrality. Crockett paused for a moment as she absorbed the dismissive tone and the visible amusement on Justice Kavanaugh's face. What happened next would silence not only Kavanaugh, but the entire bench, and would force national conversation about how women advocates were treated in the Supreme Court. She stated with controlled intensity that she was indeed drawing parallels between reproductive health care legislation and civil rights protections because both involved congressional efforts to protect fundamental aspects of human dignity and autonomy against state interference. She noted that historical opponents of civil rights legislation had used identical arguments about federal overreach and state sovereignty that Justice Kavanaugh was now deploying against reproductive health care protections. She observed that dismissing such parallels with laughter revealed either ignorance of civil rights history or willful blindness to how constitutional arguments had been weaponized throughout American history to resist federal protection of marginalized populations. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the implications of what Crockett had just stated registered with everyone present. She had not simply answered Justice Kavanaugh's dismissive question, but had called out his contemptuous demeanor as reflecting either inadequate understanding of constitutional history or deliberate refusal to acknowledge how his arguments fit within long traditions of resisting federal civil rights enforcement. The response was devastating because it made explicit what many had observed, but few had dared articulate directly, that some justices approached reproductive rights cases with predetermined hostility that prevented them from engaging seriously with constitutional arguments supporting federal protections. Crockett continued before Justice Kavanaugh could respond, noting that she had appeared before many courts throughout her career as a civil rights attorney and had never before witnessed a Supreme Court justice laugh at constitutional arguments presented by an advocate. She stated that such behavior would be considered inappropriate in any courtroom in America and questioned whether different standards applied when women attorneys presented arguments about reproductive rights before male justices who would never personally face the consequences of denying such protections. Her observation made explicit the gender dynamics that had been implicit in Kavanaugh's dismissive treatment, forcing acknowledgement that his response might reflect not simply disagreement with her arguments, but disrespect rooted in who was making those arguments and what rights were at issue. The silence on the bench was profound and uncomfortable. Justice Kavanaugh's face had gone from amused skepticism to evident shock at being confronted so directly about his demeanor. Chief Justice Roberts appeared uncertain whether to intervene to defend the court's dignity or to allow the moment to pass without further highlighting the problematic behavior. The liberal justices looked vindicated that someone had finally called out treatment that they had long observed but had limited ability to address given institutional constraints. Other conservative justices appeared uncomfortable, recognizing that Kavanaugh's behavior had created a situation that reflected poorly on the entire court, regardless of how individual justices viewed the underlying legal questions. Justice Sotomayor broke the silence by asking Crockett to continue with her constitutional analysis, effectively moving past the confrontation while implicitly supporting her right to defend herself against dismissive treatment. Crockett proceeded to complete her presentation of arguments supporting the legislation's constitutional foundations, her composure demonstrating that calling out inappropriate behavior had not diminished her capacity to continue functioning as an effective advocate. The remainder of oral argument proceeded with notably more respectful engagement from all justices, as if Crockett's willingness to demand appropriate treatment had reset expectations for how the proceeding would be conducted. The immediate aftermath of oral argument saw unprecedented public discussion of judicial temperament and gender dynamics at the Supreme Court. Legal ethics experts noted that judges had obligations to maintain decorum and to treat advocates with respect regardless of personal views about cases or arguments presented. Judicial codes of conduct prohibited behavior that created appearances of bias or that demeaned participants in judicial proceedings. Kavanaugh's visible amusement and dismissive tone toward a woman advocate presenting reproductive rights arguments raised questions about whether he could approach such cases with the impartiality that judicial office required. Women attorneys and advocates shared experiences of having faced similar dismissive treatment in courts and professional settings, noting that Crockett's willingness to call out such behavior publicly represented an important moment for professional respect and gender equality. Many described situations in which they had presented sophisticated legal arguments only to face condescension or amusement from male judges or opposing counsel who treated women's professional expertise as inherently less credible than men's. Crockett's response demonstrated that such treatment could and should be challenged directly, rather than simply endured as an inevitable aspect of professional life for women in male-dominated legal environments. Civil rights organizations noted parallels between Crockett's treatment and historical patterns in which advocates for marginalized populations face disrespect and prejudgment from judges who viewed their claims as lacking merit. Before hearing arguments, they observed that judicial impartiality required approaching all cases with genuine openness to persuasion, rather than predetermined conclusions that prevented serious engagement with arguments. The visible amusement Kavanaugh had displayed suggested he had already decided the case and found constitutional arguments supporting reproductive health care protections so implausible as to be laughable rather than deserving careful consideration. Conservative legal commentators struggled to defend Kavanaugh's behavior while maintaining that his substantive legal positions remained valid. Some attempted to characterize Crockett's response as inappropriate advocacy that crossed boundaries between zealous representation and personal attacks on judicial officers. However, this characterization failed to acknowledge that Crockett had responded to Kavanaugh's own breach of appropriate judicial demeanor and that her statements had addressed his behavior rather than making personal attacks unrelated to courtroom conduct. Others suggested that Kavanaugh's reaction had been misinterpreted and that he had not actually laughed at her arguments, but multiple observers confirmed that his amusement had been visible and audible to those present in the courtroom. The Supreme Court ultimately issued a fractured decision several months later that upheld some provisions of the reproductive health care legislation while striking down others as exceeding congressional authority. Justice Kavanaugh joined the majority opinion in validating certain provisions, but wrote separately in a way that notably avoided the dismissive tone he had displayed during oral argument. Legal observers suggested that the public controversy following the oral argument exchange might have influenced how he approached the case and his opinion, making him more cautious about appearing to prejudge reproductive rights claims or to treat them as unworthy of serious consideration. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the confrontation with Justice Kavanaugh elevated her standing within the legal profession and among advocates who had long experienced dismissive treatment in professional settings but had rarely seen such behavior challenged so directly and effectively. Her willingness to demand respect while continuing to present sophisticated constitutional arguments demonstrated that maintaining professional dignity did not require accepting disrespect from those in positions of authority. The moment established her as someone willing to challenge power when necessary to protect both her own credibility and the integrity of legal proceedings. The broader implications extended to ongoing conversations about Supreme Court reform and judicial accountability. The incident highlighted limitations of existing mechanisms for addressing inappropriate judicial behavior, as Supreme Court justices faced no meaningful oversight or discipline for conduct that would be sanctionable in lower courts. Reform advocates pointed to the episode as evidence that the court needed enforceable ethics standards and accountability mechanisms that would apply to Supreme Court justices with the same force they applied to all other federal judges. The exchange also raised questions about the relationship between judicial temperament and substantive decision-making. Kavanaugh's visible amusement at reproductive rights arguments suggested that his decisions in such cases might reflect predetermined views that prevented genuine engagement with opposing positions. This observation reinforced concerns that some justices approached controversial cases with ideological commitments that overrode their capacity for impartial adjudication. While all judges brought perspectives shaped by personal experiences and philosophical commitments, maintaining judicial impartiality required genuine openness to persuasion and serious engagement with arguments, even when they conflicted with prior assumptions. Thanks for watching this remarkable Supreme Court confrontation between Justice Kavanaugh and Jasmine Crockett that exposed critical issues regarding judicial temperament, gender dynamics in legal advocacy, and respect for constitutional arguments on reproductive rights. This exchange represents far more than a momentary courtroom drama, revealing fundamental questions about how our highest court approaches cases involving women's rights and whether advocates can expect impartial engagement with their constitutional reasoning. Please subscribe immediately and enable notifications to receive comprehensive analysis as the Supreme Court issues its decision in this landmark case and as conversations continue about judicial ethics, accountability, and reform of Supreme Court practices. Share your perspective in the comments regarding this confrontation and whether Crockett's response appropriately addressed problematic judicial behavior or whether her directness crossed boundaries of courtroom decorum. Our coverage will examine all implications of this moment for reproductive rights litigation, judicial conduct standards, and the broader culture of constitutional advocacy before the Supreme Court. So subscribe now to stay informed on these developments that affect both the substance of fundamental rights and the process through which those rights are adjudicated in our legal system.